And it's my great pleasure this afternoon to welcome Lord Purvis of Treat from the House of Lords. He's the Lib Dem spokesman on a spokesperson on international affairs and international trade in the Lords, and he is a Liberal Democrat peer and was the youngest peer when he was elevated to the House of Lords in 2013. He has a long and distinguished history in the House of Lords, not least because he also has been a great promoter and proposer of constitutional reform in the United Kingdom. This afternoon, he's going to talk to us about Brexit, lessons learned from the parliamentary process. The floor is yours, Lord Purvis.
Thank you, Dr. Garing. Very nice to be with you. And thank you to Felicity and the team for putting this together. And I'm very pleased to be with you. And I would prefer for this evening to share with you some reflections and thoughts, and hopefully that can be either provocative or stimulating to allow some of the discussion and some of the students and others who I suspect have a greater technical knowledge and certainly legal knowledge than I have. So I will try and limit my thoughts and reflections to being a parliamentarian. I will say at the outset that I'm very pleased to see you wearing the Sustainable Development Gold badge. Mine is next door in my office here. And today has been a busy day in the Lords for me, having meetings on that subject and on Afghanistan, as well as I sit on the European Affairs Select Committee. But today we had a private notice question, which is an urgent question that's raised on the asking for clarification of Lord Frost's speech in Lisbon last night. So the title of the thought of lessons learned, my first reflection is that either we're still making the mistakes and we haven't learned our lessons from the Brexit process, or it is far too soon. And I'm sure there are endless Chinese proverbs about this being an endless process, or how soon it is to learn from some of these lessons. But we are still in the process. And as much as the Prime Minister and others have indicated that Brexit has been done, far from it. We are still in a very long process. And I'll share some thoughts about why I think that this is a longer term process, and why Parliament, either very poorly equipped since after the referendum to manage this process in a way that brought people together, and is poorly equipped to manage the process going forward. Inevitably, these are my own personal views, not necessarily just of my party, but they're formed of being a parliamentarian for nearly 18 years now. I was an elected member of the Scottish Parliament before I was appointed to the House of Lords. And I've taken an interest in the UK Constitution and its deficiencies, in my view, in the past, and suggested areas where we could try and make some changes. But the lion's share of that interest had been before the European referendum. But I will make a comment about how the European referendum and Brexit is linked with the country where I live. When I travel back from the Lords, I go back to the Scottish borders, and the Scottish referendum. And we are having a bringing together of a number of different pressures on the British Constitution and in our body politic, which I will have some reflections on. But I wanted to start almost with a kind of a pub quiz. I don't think I'm allowed to ask for answers at this stage, right at the start of my thoughts. But I wanted to give three statistics, 3 percentage figures. And some of you might spot exactly what they are, but let me give you in chronological order of 44.7%, 48.11%, and 43.6%. Now, what is the common factor among those sets of statistics? Well, the obvious one, of course, it doesn't take an economist to work out, they're all less than 50%. It's a very obvious point, but one where many people will, on some elements, they don't massively appreciate, but they're all less than 50%. They're all the votes of people. The smallest brought about the biggest mandate. So the first percentage point was those that lost the Scottish referendum, and that was the vote leave, and they lost. The largest of those three, the 48.11%, was those that voted remain. As a share of the electorate, those that voted to leave the European Union was a smaller share of the UK electorate than those in Scotland who voted leave in the referendum as a share of the electorate. So of those who voted and had an opportunity to vote, who chose to take part, there was the percentage. The lowest figure was the Conservative Party vote, which heralded in a majority of 80 seats, which is a thumping majority for the Boris Johnson administration. So the smallest of those mandates has now created what the government will claim is the biggest mandate to deliver on the views of the people in the 2016 referendum. You might think I'm just playing around with statistics to make almost a debating point. But what we have seen within Parliament is the bringing together of those that used the term mandate at an extraordinarily high degree. Certainly after the referendum, and even after the Theresa May 2017 election result, and then increasingly so after that, and when Boris Johnson secured that majority on the first past the post system. Now, mandate is something which is not really set down in a lot of parliamentary procedures, because if you take the Dicey view of parliamentary sovereignty and you take the historical traditional view of Parliament being sovereign within the United Kingdom, which has for those constitutional lawyers studying, will know the Dicey and will have traced back to a lot of the English philosophers from the 17th century onwards, not necessarily British, because the Scottish approach has been distinct from that within England. But the view of parliamentary sovereignty has meant that the mandate of the people is not really a defined concept. But nevertheless, it's been used as either weaponized politically or certainly been used within Parliament. And the reason why I think it's been very significant is because that mandate of a minority of the people in the general election, reflecting a majority in the referendum, but has then effectively been absorbed by the executive, not by the legislature. And my first lesson that I learned as a parliamentarian was that our system provides an enormous power to the executive, and that power has grown significantly. The process of legislating for the Brexit process included a study by the Hansard Society that by the end of 2020, ministers had laid around 960 statutory instruments that were Brexit related, and there have been more since, and there has continued to be. And a very large proportion of those have included broad delegated powers, termed as Henry VIII powers, as many of you will know who are studying this. And those powers have provided a great level of authority to the government that can bring forward measures which cannot be amended. They have limited ways of either cancelling them out. For example, the statutory instrument, the official opposition in the House of Lords, whilst the House of Lords has a veto power over these, the official opposition takes the view that it doesn't use that veto power. And I think there's only been less than a handful since the Second World War of statutory instruments. And those delegated powers range from everything from simply changing the names of certain agencies or making sure that the technicalities were correct, right through to quite sweeping policy powers. The statement that Lord Frost gave on behalf of the government a few weeks ago, which had indicated that the government is now going to be systematically reviewing all of the EU retained law, which I asked whether there was also going to be reviewing the delegated powers that the government had provided to itself. And I didn't get an answer. And I suspect very much that the review on the EU retained legislation will bring about even further delegated powers. Now, this is somewhere where 3 committees of the House of Lords have railed against the use of the Henry VIII powers, but the extent of those being expanded since the 2019 general election has been exponential. And with the legislations that have been secondary to the Brexit process, such as the internal market legislation, we're currently studying the professional qualifications. There will be other legislation which are putting in place the different approach since Brexit. All of those also include significant Henry VIII powers. I think since I've been in the Lords, there's been amendments passed the Lords to remove them all and have been reinserted in the Commons. So the House of Lords has tried to maintain a consistent position that the Brexit process should not be a process that affords the executive a much greater set of authority. The reason why you're seeing the SDG badge on your lapel, Marcus, is close to my heart, as I took through legislation for putting on the statute book 0.7% of UK GNI to overseas development assistance. That's now been changed, not by legislation, but by a new Treasury target, which is not set down in law, and with fiscal tests which haven't even been covered by any form of statutory instrument at all. So the trend, the second lesson I've learned is that the trend is to much greater executive authority. We've seen this also in the third area, which is another one of the consequences, which is in the independent trade policy of the UK. It was inevitable when Theresa May made the decision that we would be leaving the customs union, again by executive speech, not by a set of negotiating mandates which had been approved by Parliament. That was considered to be contrary to prerogative authority, even though the European Union published negotiating mandate. We needed to revise and to put on a continuity basis the trade agreements for the UK. At many attempts, the House of Lords in particular sought to increase the power of Parliament over the making of the trade agreements. They were turned down by the House of Commons when it came to the legislative process for the ping-pong process. So a British parliamentarian in the House of Commons or in the House of Lords now has less parliamentary influence over UK trade outside the European Union Customs Union than a British MEP had when we were a member of the European Union. And the European Parliament has the opportunity of having a final say over trade agreements. The UK Parliament does not. We have the Constitutional and Reform Act, the Cragg Act from 2010, which even though it meant that there was a stalling ability for treaties that Parliament would be able to have, it could effectively decline to ratify an agreement. That is a power which is unworkable in the 21st century. And the government has refused to increase the role of Parliament. Now, why do I think that this is significant? Well, as with many people probably not either understanding or caring about the percentage points that I mentioned beforehand, or thinking it's a debating point, the concept of bringing back control, which was a Burkean thread in Lord Frost's speech that he gave in Lisbon last night. I'm not a historian, but I know enough about Burke to think that probably if he was alive, if he was born today in Dublin, he would probably be a very strong supporter of a single market. But nevertheless, that kind of why I think it's significant for Parliament is that when it comes to control and bringing back control, some people might have thought that that was to our Parliament, which under the same people who make the case that it's Dyson sovereignty. But in effect, the control has become much stronger to the government of the day. The reason why I think it's significant, and my final lesson, I want to perhaps leave on the most provocative part to stimulate some thoughts, is that I saw lead up to the Scottish referendum, and then I've seen since that the United Kingdom is now a state of nations more than it is a nation state. And the tensions that exist because of identity and nationalism have they've grown quite significantly over the last 15 years, but they are now becoming an entrenched part of our body politic and our narrative at an executive and governmental level. This is, to me, a very considerable worry. I'm a creature of the Union. I was born in Berwick-upon-Tweed. I grew up there. I represented a border constituency. This is something which is very close to my heart. I know I'm biased, but nevertheless, I've seen that many of the political imperatives and the dynamics and the motivations have been about identity and the national approach, less so about a philosophical drive or even on ideology. It is much more about identity and nationalism. I read Lord Frost's speech last night, as I read his previous speeches that he'd given in Brussels, with an air of foreboding from a cabinet minister in the UK government using very strident nationalistic arguments. And whilst we can be patriotic, almost the genius of our union, and indeed for some who argue that it's better to have a more flexible organic constitution like the UK rather than a more set down written approach, means that that flexibility has been able to accommodate different identities and nationalisms without them coming to the fore, without them being the major factor. But I think when it drives an English nationalistic approach, it is very hard for any political party which is looking to form an administration to move back from that approach. Parliaments are better at doing that by the fact that they are spread across the UK and they are broadly elected on a popular mandate. I would, there's that word again, mandate. I would prefer it to be proportional, of course, and I think if we're wanting to get into the realms of alternative histories, I wonder what would have happened after the referendum on Brexit if the House of Commons was elected on a proportional representation basis. I suspect that Brexit would be a very different form of Brexit than with the one that we have at the moment. So the conclusions that I reach, I'm afraid, are not necessarily happy ones. We have an ostensibly foreign policy which is termed Global Britain, which is almost anything but. We have an approach where we are arguing that we brought back control but the power that I have as a legislator is now diminished. The authority of the executive is stronger, and that is on 43.6%. So going forward, and I would love to hear some thoughts from some of the students, others, is how do we manage this? Well, one of the areas where we might have to think about for the long term is going through a process of defining mandate. What is a genuine mandate from the people? Over what period of time? How is that decided? What does a mandate mean? What are the consequences for when a government of the day decide what a mandate is? They said that they had a mandate, majority of 80, to deliver a manifesto, and we hear that constantly. When I point out that the manifesto was talking about maintaining 0.7% on GNI for aid, they said, oh, well, that's, none of us expected the pandemic, and therefore we have to adjust. Well, if mandates are fluid in certain areas because of circumstances, when are they not fluid? So what does it mean? What do we want when there is a decision about what the mandate? What do the people then want after they have cast their vote? And even if there are now, where we see, by and large, decisions made or governments formed, all by minorities, if we have a system of minorities, but a winner-takes-all approach, how can the British Constitution maintain or reduce nationalism, which only has really one conclusion to it, which is a border poll in Northern Ireland and another Scottish referendum? Because if we are failing to have our constitution and our parliament work on this, then we will rely on the Supreme Court to make decisions or the executive of the day. Neither of those are desirable. And I am trying again to have a private member's bill for a constitutional convention, at least as a way of just debating some of these. But I hope at least some of those reflections may have prompted some people to be fiercely opposed to what I've said, or just confused. But either way, I'd love to hear from people, either with direct questions or any of the contributions for anything that I've said.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Lord Purves. And you're quite right? What I had hoped the referendum would be a beautiful sort of expression of direct community democracy turned into one of the ugliest periods of the British constitutional history. But that's maybe a more personal reflection. Do we have any questions? There are none in the Q&A. So I'm looking at some of our attendees to indicate if they wanted to ask any questions. Now is your opportunity. And while we wait for questions, let me ask you this, Jeremy. In certain in certain constitutional structures, the comparison with how other countries do it have a lot of traction, right? They seem to not have a lot of traction in the United Kingdom, and I don't fully understand why. So can you explain why sort of comparative constitutional law and how other sort of entities deal with, for example, having different nations under the roof of one state, why none of those comparators seem to have any particular traction in the United Kingdom context?
Thanks, Mark. Well, I know it's an obvious thing to say, but of course there hasn't been a country like the UK, and there will not be another system like that, even though we've tried to impose our approach on many others around the world with varying degrees of success, either the Westminster model. But the Westminster model has at some elements a couple of fundamental cores. I mentioned those from the 17th century, which still has a degree of traction for considering what an English constitution, or then an English constitutional approach would be as far as the rights of people, as well as what the relationship with the Crown in Parliament after our various English civil wars and then the Glorious Revolution. And it's a cliche, I know, but you look at, for what some of the constitutional theorists in the past would be saying, is that we don't have a constitution which is a machine, which then you can have the inputs and you can expect a process and there's outputs for this. Ours is a tree. It's an organic thing, and it needs to be completely nurtured, and often there's trimming and pruning, etc. But fundamentally, it's an organic kind of a creature. And they've argued that that's the case for allowing the flexibilities. We didn't have a French Revolution. Then we had our different reform processes coming up. The difficulty with it, and where it's basically come to a very difficult situation, is that those that made that argument were in many cases the strongest opponents to referendum, because either the referendum was a symptomatic of the mob in 18th century or earlier, therefore we should be fearful of it, and you don't have that. You either have direct representation, or you have implied representation in Parliament. Now, what seemed to be curious to me is that those who've been the strongest advocates of the organic nature of the British Constitution now seem to be the strongest in favour of referendum without defining what that mandate is. Now, therefore, what that means, we're in a difficult position, because intellectually in a narrative, you have that difficulty of maintaining a fluid, organic constitution, which you can make up on the way, which put a crown on top of it and create a tradition, and it looks good. But then now the term mandate and them defining when it suits them of what a mandate is. And in the absence of there being that process-orientated system, which is more common within the EU 27, I'm not saying unique, because the Spanish system is probably a bit more like the British system than the German system, etc., etc. Nevertheless, that more machine-oriented process, I felt, was able to accommodate the consequences of legislating for Brexit than ours, given the fact that we were almost split down the middle. And when the government made the decision not to reach out to the losing side and say that basically you were 48%, therefore about half of what Brexit will look like you will be comfortable with. Theresa May made the decision to go for a hard Brexit, of then that effectively from that point on, from that speech on, in my view, set down that mandate is now going to be used as our constitution without it then being defined. And we're still in that process. Lord Frost last night said that that the European Union has to respect what effectively is the democratic will of the British people to do this for the mandate that's been received for it. And therefore the power that we now have got over immigration, and he gave a couple of other examples, which puzzled me, because he used as an example of us giving visas to those who've been in Hong Kong, which we had the power to do beforehand anyway. So that I think they're even struggling to find what the real differences are. But I think I don't know what the end point is. I suspect that the Supreme Court is going to be in effect, we are creating a constitutional court in the Supreme Court, which was never the intention, but in effect we are. And I suspect that I had sympathy with what the Canadians did after the second Quebec referendum, which was to debate and put through a Clarity Act, but ultimately the Supreme Court in Canada had reviewed that and had the views. I think we need something similar along those lines, as to work through what you actually mean by some of these terminologies.
Yeah, very good. And I think we need to come back to Lord Frost's, for an EU migrant, slightly confusing speech. I think he didn't have me as his audience in mind, to be fair. But before we do that, we've got a question from my CELS colleague and the newest member of the CELS family, our Deputy Director, Dr. Emilia Lenate, who thanks you for a highly stimulating speech and wonders whether you think we should also learn certain lessons on accountability. Should there be some kind of increase of accountability of the executive as a consequence of Brexit? For example, the current disturbances in the supply chain in line with the increase of the executive's power?
Undoubtedly, I set what we mean by accountability. Ultimately, it's the accountability of the government to Parliament. In the absence of there being quite a significant shake-up in that balance of responsibilities between the executive and Parliament, I can't see it. I can't see it happening. Parliament did assert its authority during the Brexit discussions, which you remember when it took upon itself the decision to set the parliamentary calendar in order for there to be a vote to force the government not to have a no-deal Brexit. Now, that was unprecedented in my time. I think it hadn't happened before in the way that it had happened. I was relaxed about that process. Many people thought it was revolutionary, but I was quite relaxed about that process. The government felt that that was significantly altering the prerogative power on the ability of the government to negotiate on behalf of the country, which was not correct. But nevertheless, they used that argument. And Lord Frost referred to it last night. He says that, and this is the position of the person who negotiated the agreement, to say that he could not have negotiated a better agreement because his hands were tied and his negotiating hand was weakened by Parliament. Now, and therefore, we need a new agreement that he negotiated, presumably because now he no longer has constraints. He's got complete liberty to decide what he wants to do. But he hasn't, to my knowledge, shared the draft legal text with the cross-community groups in Northern Ireland. He certainly hasn't shared it with Parliament. He hasn't done. So he does. I don't think that they want accountability. I think that's an obvious thing to say, presumably for any government, to some extent. But they see it very much as a negative. And I saw it. I was covering international trade for my party, and I was very active in the trade bill. It was very interesting that the government was fiercely opposed to the Parliament asking for the final say on trade agreements and having sight of the negotiating objectives. And they said it would weaken our position and it would mean that we would have worse deals. Now, when I speak to my colleagues in the European Parliament or the Japanese Parliament or Congress in America who have these, then the governments and their negotiators say our hands are stronger, because we could say, oh, well, you might want this, UK, but we will never get it through Congress. Therefore, you're never going to get it. So governments use their parliaments much more proactively, and we haven't. So it was a curious thing to me that Brexit has been almost been constitution redux. It's gone back to ways of parliamentary and executive relationships, which go back to pre-70s, when the rest of the world has moved on to a far more complex, iterative, nuanced position of the relationship between the two. We still have this. And at every opportunity when it comes to legislation, curiously, it is the unelected House of Lords, which is making the case for accountability. And then they tend to be defeated when they go back to the Commons. So I'm not sure, make of that as you wish when the unelected House is calling for greater accountability.
Yeah, it's slightly troubling because it sort of calls into question the entire taking back control and kind of rhetoric that we had so much from, heard so much from during the referendum campaign. But I'm very interested in sort of EU external relations and international law more generally. How do you see the sort of sable rattling that Lord Frost engages in, his very unique negotiation style? How do you see that playing out for the United Kingdom? I can tell you, because I follow a little bit of the continental media, that quite frankly, people are not amused. I was wondering who has the last laugh in this affair.
You mentioned, you almost answered your own question, Marcus, earlier when you said where you thought that Lord Frost wasn't speaking to you in his speech. And it is a diminishing, I think in one respect, I hope that it's a diminishing audience that he is speaking to, because that audience is very clearly those who want to stay faithful to the Brexit approach. It's interesting that I don't know if he is the Lenin or the Trotsky of this argument, but certainly it is. He's positioning himself as the owner of the revolution, and therefore, if you are making counter-revolutionary comments like wanting to be open and work with the European Union, etc., that's counter to what a narrative has to be put forward. Presumably, it's the case that they have to demonstrate, a bit like Putin, that in order for us to succeed, they have to lose. And that is, I would probably think that is very counter to the organization that we have just left, because part of the whole thrust of the European Union is that everybody should gain. And it's messy because some people, that means that sometimes you go for the lowest common denominator or you go for that, but fundamentally everybody needs something out of it. Well, the UK now is in this position where we want to say that they have lost and they've capitulated. And that I think caused both anger and anxiety from our former allies and friends who saw the UK as very significant in helping them gain within that European fraternity. Now it's met with a degree of a shrug for many people, and therefore the impact from the British cabinet minister making some of these speeches will become less and less and less. And because to our international friends, it becomes heightened to the domestic audience who want to listen to it, because they're already the ones where it's providing that red meat to them. On election night, when I was in Germany, I was watching the coverage of it, and I was struck. I wrote it down because Anthony Gardner, who was the former US ambassador to the EU under Obama, simply said the reason why this is the most important process at the moment within the German election is, I quote, "Germany is now the leader of the 27 since the UK has left." And many people who are on the progressive side around the world saw the UK leaving a leadership role. And we can't admit that because we deny the strength of that organization that we left, because we had to revolt. There was a revolution for us to leave it. So therefore, we can't admit that there was a leadership role within Europe because, as Lord Frost said, it was a bad dream that we will remember. So therefore, how you should be aware of how others see us, and we're not doing a lot of that at the moment. We are speaking to ourselves, and the Scottish Nationalists do exactly the same, and the DUP are doing that. So this is where that nationalism and identity danger is coming in, because we are talking to ourselves. But of course, the government kind of will believe that you put the slogan Global Britain on it, and that means it's fine, but it doesn't, because the substance of it means that we are becoming more insular.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I was really struck. And by the way, Anthony Gardner gave a brilliant CELS lecture about 4 years ago, where he was our Mackenzie Stewart lecturer, where he highlighted the sort of the transatlantic, the bigger transatlantic questions. So what's the relationship between the United States and Europe, not between individual member states and the United States as such. I was struck by the sort of manufactured problem, and I wondered whether you see it the same way, of the Northern Ireland Protocol, by the government now saying one of the communities adamantly rejects the Northern Ireland Protocol, therefore it needs to be replaced. I was always under the impression that the DUP, from the very beginning, when they were sold down the river by Prime Minister Johnson in the fall of 2 years ago, had strong objections to the Northern Ireland Protocol from the beginning. So what exactly is new about the DUP not liking the withdrawal agreement and the Northern Ireland Protocol?
To be fair to them, for one moment, they've opposed this. They didn't support this one. They didn't support this one, which is let's call it the best of both worlds. Let's quote Michael Gove, who was the minister who signed it off. So Lord Frost negotiated it, and Michael Gove signed it off. So it's the best of both worlds protocol, which they're now saying is the worst of each. And that and its immediate predecessor, which they did oppose, was in effect the only thing that, once they decided on the hard exit of leaving the customs union, meant that the previous attempts to try and have the whole of the UK in a form of regulatory alignment, which Theresa May had floated, of which Boris Johnson then resigned from the government over, they're really fundamentally only those two options. I can't see what a brand new protocol would say if it includes that part of the United Kingdom is still going to be part of the single market. And Lord Frost is not denying that Northern Ireland will continue to be part of the single market. He wants the UK to administer and legislate for, and then have judicial oversight, part of the European Union single market, which will never be accepted. So therefore, we are in a tricky situation going forward. Now, I have very fundamental problems with the protocol. And those fundamental problems are not being proposed to be removed by Lord Frost. For example, if you are a business within Britain, you have to, and this was a decision made by the Boris Johnson government, you have to register as an exporter to send your goods to Northern Ireland. If they've delayed it, but nevertheless, the government made the decision for labelling for accreditation, it'll have to have a separate label. that wasn't the European Union, that was the British government doing it. There's a whole set of areas where the UK government will be maintaining the fact that part of the UK is operating under a tax and a legislative system, which in part is being decided by a foreign entity over which we have zero democratic say. And this is where you may be a purist, but whenever the argument for bring back control, they've given a foreign entity direct authority over making certain rules and certain decisions over part of the United Kingdom without any form of representation at all, which never has existed in our history. And therefore, that is a very fundamental democratic deficit that exists. And Lord Frost's new proposal, I've not seen the draft text, I'm not sure if they've been published today, but I don't think that's going to address it. So we are going to be in this position because of the approach that Lord Frost and others have made, which is to elevate the drama, but they fundamentally know that some of the difficulties that for the DUP going forward, who have themselves elevated the drama for their own, because of their own political dynamic against the other parties within Northern Ireland. So we're in a very sensitive situation, which I think will last years and years and years.
This doesn't bode well for future constitutional debates. And in that sense, we have our next question from Professor David Feldman, the Emeritus Rose Ball Professor of English Law here in the university and our colleague in the law faculty. He asked a question about the capacity of Parliament to take control over the implementation of Brexit. Do you think that the two houses have the resources, time, personnel, expertise to take control of, for example, a comprehensive study of retained EU law and the capacity to decide questions to which there are so many possible conclusions?
It's a really good and fundamental question, and I would really like to say yes, but I think that we have got the capacity to study and to analyze and to debate and to discuss within our committees. We do not have the capacity of securing the time in Parliament with ministers to properly scrutinise what the government itself is proposing. An interesting example, which is very live, is that the Parliament is moving ahead on setting up the Parliamentary Assembly with the European Parliament, which is to oversee some of the aspects of the TCA. There is a clause in the treaty that assembly will have the power to ask for and receive papers. I asked the clerks of my select committee how does that compare with the powers that we have in our select committees? And he simply smiled and said, well, that's a treaty obligation, they have more power. So we could be in an ironic situation where if we really wanted to see some of the government to government or government to commission interaction on the implementation of Brexit through the TCA, then we may have to go through that route. And therefore, we could be seeing the emergence of a new interesting relationship with our European our MEP colleagues who may have a similar mutual interest. Let's take visa and travel for creative industries, for example, which harming us massively and a great nuisance and annoyance to them. That could be a role for Parliament to come in, but we have to assert ourselves. The Lords no longer has its fully and very well budgeted European committee with its subcommittees. I'm in the European Affairs Committee. It is not a super committee, it is a committee with modest resources. brilliant staff, a committee which I think in the House of Lords is doing a superb job, which is the International Agreements Committee. There is no equivalent in the Commons. I think the Lords, funnily enough, has got far better capacity, Professor Feldman, than the House of Commons committees, which is depressing, but nevertheless this case. And we just have to continuously assert ourselves. It doesn't necessarily help when the House of Commons itself is by and large dependent on the leader of the House and the government, as far as its budget, its resources, etc. So just look at what was going on with the establishment of the European Committee, with Bill Cash and the House of Lords. So therefore, the Commons will have to assert itself, and with the current government, with a majority the size of it, I don't necessarily see that happening. My appeal is to people like yourselves, to UK and a Changing Union, academics, think tanks, NGOs, to do a lot of this work, feed it into us, of which we've got some excellent people to do it. And then it's incumbent on us to try and secure more time. But I'll go back to what I said in my opening remarks. What were the figures from the Hansel Society? Up until the end of 2020, 960 Brexit SIs with delegated powers. So if they are wanting to do this approach through a great deal of moving some of the EU retained law, which they had put through SIs anyway, and then making those into UK-based SIs, and then with them policy changes, our hands are tied. So we have to be as assertive as we can and as strong as we can.
I'm afraid that is unfortunately all we really have time for in this very short hour. This has been very inspiring, and it's always good for us in our sort of shiny ivory tower to learn more about the sort of the business and the operation of parliaments for parliamentarians that are actually in the thick of it. I'm slightly worried now about the prospects of UK-EU relations in the near and not so distant future. But on behalf of CELS, I would like to warmly thank you for your willingness to give this very first CELS seminar, and for your contribution to the Faculty of Law this afternoon. Thank you very much, Lord Purvis, and we hope to see you on a future occasion, hopefully then, if the global pandemic permits, in person.
Thank you, Marcus, and best of luck for your continuing season, for your, and I hope I wasn't too depressing. We can all have a good bit of UK produce from my home country, which is a glass of Scotch whiskey, which always cheers me up at the end of the day. So we can all, so thank you very much, and please stay in touch.
Absolutely, thank you very much, and that concludes our seminar. Thank you to everyone.